Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ian Pad, and I'm the peacemonger. Today is what is today? Today's Wednesday. It's the 10th of February, and I can't believe how time is flying. Thank you so much for joining me today for another daily update. I hope to make these a more regular thing as I figure out how the technology works. But I'm delighted to see those people who are joining me right now on this sunny in Hampshire Wednesday. Obviously, there's quite a bit to talk about today. I wanted to start off with the fourth anniversary of the end of the start, sadly, of the terrible war in Ukraine, and the kind of sadly depressing sight of Boris Johnson turning up in Kiev, along with lots of other kind of prominent world figures, looking fat, self-obsessed, and like he'd been dragged backwards through a hedge after a rollicking night with a Bullingdon club and lots of wenches. Oh my goodness me! I mean, how on earth can a politician who royally messed up his time as Prime Minister of the UK arrive with such fanfare, in Ukraine? It's remarkable that these kind of figures just show up as if they're heroes, having totally messed up their own countries. But there you go. Boris Johnson was there talking about well, two things: supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. How long? How many times have we heard, frankly, that refrain said before? Except it's taking too long. And in the next breath, he said that he hoped there wouldn't be a fifth anniversary of the war, the fifth anniversary of the starting of the war. So that's a year from now, while offering absolutely no ideas of how to end the war. In fact, the subtext appeared to be that in the next year we should jolly well see these Russians off and finally deliver that strategic defeat that he encouraged Zelensky to push for when he went in April in 2022 and encouraged Zelensky not to take the Istanbul sort of peace deal. I mean, how completely deluded, is that? I think that the sooner the Ukrainians stop naming their streets after Boris Johnson and actually inviting him over to visit as some sort of, oracle of the future, I think the better. The other visitor was Alastair Campbell, the former director of communications for Tony Blair at the time of the war in Iraq, which started in 2003. Of course, this is a guy who's refashioned himself as some oracle about how to do good strategic communications with his very on vogue podcast with a similarly self-promoting Rory Stewart. I started listening to it at the beginning, but I found that the self-promotion puke-inducing, quite frankly, so I stopped. I do watch Ed Balls and George Osborne. It's another systemic thing, but I actually quite like their commentary because they very much focus on the political and economic aspects. And I think they're, in their own ways, fairly decent commentators. But Alastair Campbell, I mean, this is a guy that encouraged the head of the Joint Intelligence Committee to fiddle with the intelligence dossier to provide Tony Blair with the justification to support George W. Bush in going to war in Iraq, when there was no evidence that Iraq actually had accumulated weapons of mass destruction, which was, the strapline that was essentially used to unleash this, this war and the kind of related war on terror, which devastated the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not more, people in the Middle East in particular. And the specifics of that are actually that, I was involved in looking at the initial intelligence dossier after 9/11. I think the reason was that I was then head of the Indonesia department at the Foreign Office, and as Indonesia was the largest Muslim country in the world, they thought, well, getting in to kind of have an independent kind of view of the intelligence. So I would sit around the table at these meetings, and it's important to understand that these dossiers are essentially, we have what's called the assessment staff in the Cabinet Office, and they look at all the available intelligence, and they basically write a report. They write an assessment based on it, which is, if you like, like a piece of research. So they summarize the relevant bits of intelligence, and then they reach their judgments. And of course, it is a judgment. I mean, intelligence isn't a perfect science. human sources will tell us what we want to hear. Even people whose phones we're tapping will say things in the knowledge or in the sort of a belief that their calls may well have been intercepted and therefore saying things for the purpose to deceive. I mean, I lost count of the number of times when I was at the British Embassy in Moscow when I was in the unclassified parts of the building and I'd randomly say stuff that was untrue. You know, working on the assumption that some of it will be heard by Russian listeners. So, I mean, intelligence isn't a perfect science, but these assessments kind of summarize the intelligence that we've got, and then take a judgment, on that. And that judgment was that, Iraq, wasn't really behind in any way the 9/11 attacks, which was the whole reason and genesis for this dossier being created in the first place, and also on the issue of weapons of mass destruction. Now, Alastair Campbell actually wanted that dossier to be sexed up. This very famous words if you're British, but possibly not if you've not been following this as closely. Sexed up, therefore, to kind of made more implicatory of Iraq in WMD accumulation to justify Tony Blair in supporting George W. Bush's war. So this guy literally, has blood on his hands, and yet he kind of has managed to build an incredible career as this kind of comms expert. Every now and again, he'll produce the next book about his diaries from when he's in number 10. I mean, this is 20 years ago. I mean, how many diaries does this guy keep? But he keeps kind of earning lots of money on the back of these diaries from when he was in number 10 years ago, when he encouraged the sexing up of intelligence assessments to justify this illegal war in Iraq. And that's Alastair Campbell, and so he turned up all full of high moral purpose, having a selfie and doing a video post from the Maidan Square, but oh gosh, we should, stand in solidarity with Ukraine. And of course, I do. I want the war to end. I mean, that's my solidarity with Ukraine. I want the war against Ukraine and in Ukraine to end. I think it's been an absolutely terrible kind of catastrophe. But why would anybody listen to Alastair Campbell anyway? And he had separate agendas in visiting Kiev as well. He's on this mission to get the UK to rejoin the EU. So he met some random grey-faced Ukrainian diplomat is on the Europe directorate, who presented him with a folder so he can keep his documents on his quest for the UK to rejoin the EU. And he had a post on X, about this. Is all slightly, frankly, puke-inducing, but that's just my view. I mean, when the Brexit vote took place, and I was based at the British Embassy in Moscow. I mean, I was a reluctant Ramoner, a reluctant Remainer. I sort of reluctantly thought that the benefits in terms of peace, open borders, and so on of the UK being a member of the EU, were such that they outweighed, the disadvantages. And the biggest disadvantage that I always saw with the EU was the democratic deficit of the institutions in Brussels. That has and remains, for me, the biggest kind of failure of the EU. And those deficiencies have only seemed to got worse, frankly, since the war in Ukraine has started. Because the EU has gone on this ever centralizing drive to take even more power away from the nation states at a time when citizens within the individual nation states are drifting more towards political parties that want to kind of prioritize the interests of their country and their citizens first, ahead of bigger supranational and globalist agendas like permanent proxy wars in Ukraine and so on. So while I was skeptical about the idea of Brexit as a reluctant Remainer, while I was in Russia, and I joked at the time that living in Russia as a British diplomat made me slightly less reluctant. And I would be even more reluctant now for the UK to rejoin the EU. Not that I don't think that we should have good relations with the EU. I'm passionate about sort of many of the countries in the EU. I grew up in Germany and all the rest of it. I want us to trade. I want us to engage. I want us to meet people from all over the EU. But join some big globalist, club that just wants to kind of defeat Russia and take on China next. No thanks, very much. So that was that was one of the more bizarre things he was doing. That wasn't quite as bizarre as him sort of posting on X a photograph with a former Conservative Party member of Parliament who now lives in Ukraine, Jack Lepresti, a 56-year-old former Army Reserve kind of wannabe who kind of lost his seat at the 2024 election and decided to move to Ukraine to join the Azov battalion. Just like, how messed up is that? I mean, just how completely ridiculous is that? This former Tory MP is joining a neo-Nazi affiliated kind of Ukrainian regiment. He's not fighting. He's got the DPM, little short fat bloke. Not that fat, but I mean, not slim either. With his DPM, with Alastair Campbell kind of towering above him with a horrible smile on his dreadful face. This neo-Nazi former Tory sort of MP who, while he was an MP, was involved in a sex scandal, cheating on his wife by having it off with another Tory MP, apparently at the time, and was also later accused of bullying members of his office staff as well. So a truly dreadful individual. But Alastair Campbell is bigging him up, saying, "Oh, fair play to this guy. He's given up his life and he's now moved to Kiev to support, Ukraine's valiant fight against the Russians." How bizarre! But this is the nature of British politics and media coverage today. That these worn-out, retread, lackluster figures like Alastair Campbell can still make a profitable living by talking about their screw-ups in the past and posting about sort of former Tory MPs and neo-Nazis. I should move to another country, guys. I mean, I don't know what to say about that, but my post on X has had lots and lots of positive responses and over 30,000 views so far. So it obviously resonates with somebody. So that's bizarre. Zelensky had his perfectly Kvartal 95 kind of film production on the day. I get it. He's the president. He's not been elected, but he's the president, not been elected recently. So he had to do something on this somber memorial. Of course, I get it. But it's also Hollywood, isn't it? And it's just like, there's no real sense of him actually kind of wanting to strike a deal. And an increasing kind of view among many that actually, the Europeans and the Ukrainians are trying to play it long ball and see out Trump and hope for the best in 3 years' time that they get some Democrats. Frankly, I don't think the Ukraine is going to last that long, to be perfectly honest. But this was just the kind of the tone that was set for these memorial events. And of course, it's dreadful, the war's happening. I mean, let's make the war end. All these Ursula von der Leyen, Alexander Stubb going there and, we're here for you. We're not going to send troops, but keep fighting anyway. I mean, it's just dreadful. Why can't these guys get behind, a peace deal in Ukraine? Of course, I know a peace deal involves concessions. I know, it involves dialogue with the Russians. Nobody wants to have dialogue with the Russians. I kind of get that. But at the end of the day, diplomacy is the only way out of this dreadful war, not sort of just stunts and film opportunities and perfectly produced kind of Hollywood-esque Kvartal 95 martial performances by the perfect global actor, which is kind of Vladimir Zelensky. I mean, just ridiculous. Sorry, but I was reading in the Telegraph today, which is actually a newspaper that I hate, but they've just charged me 200 quid to renew for a year, and I haven't cancelled it quick enough, so I have to cancel it now to get my money back. I don't want to be paying the Daily Telegraph, which is basically a wing of British military intelligence, as far as I can see, as it comes to its reporting on Ukraine, at least. I want to get my money back. But anyway, I read their sort of piece today. It's bizarre. Actually, it's bizarre how quickly Ukraine has fallen off the front page of the news since yesterday, just in the space of the day, which just shows the extent of war weariness in the UK. But anyway, it's saying that the coalition are willing at their meeting yesterday, which was chaired remotely by the ever charismatic Keir Starmer, dialing in from London, that the coalition of the willing now accepts that it needs Putin's consent to deploy troops to Ukraine. And I can't believe it's taken them this long to figure out what has always been blindingly obvious right from the start. I mean, the Russians have always said that NATO troops, are a red line in Ukraine. Doesn't mean they don't want to have it settle a peace deal, long term. But that has always been clear, and oh gosh, almost 1 year, since the coalition of the Witless, or the coalition of the Lemmings, or the coalition of the Shilling. Somebody suggested that on one of my posts, today, which I found quite funny. Coalition of the Shilling. Anyway, it's almost a year since that was created on a beautiful sunny day, a bit like today, actually, in Lancaster House in London. Lovely place, Lancaster House, by the way, but don't get me distracted. Almost a year, and it's taken them a year to realize that Russia won't accept the deployment of NATO troops in Ukraine. Such is the slow moving wheel of and slow moving cogs of how these kind of tiny minds work. It's quite bizarre, but nevertheless, this is an important recognition point as we move slowly towards some sort of negotiated settlement to this war. That people are figuring out that actually we can't just do what we want and expect the Russians to kind of roll over and accept it, come what may. There has to be a negotiated settlement. That negotiation has to involve Russia. Russia's concerns have to be taken into account. Of course, Ukraine's concerns have to be taken into account. But that is what a negotiation involves. It involves the two main parties, Russia and Ukraine, talking with each other, figuring out, a deal that they can live with and that they can't live with, and meeting somewhere in the middle. Now, it may be that the strategic balance of advantage sits more on the side of Russia than Ukraine in terms of what that settlement looks like. But ultimately, it has to be a settlement that both sides can sign up to, and that signing up to that will only be possible if the Europeans actually get on board and engage with the need for some sort of end to this war. If they don't, this is just going to rumble on, and on into next year, as I've long been saying. That it will. Part of that is security guarantees, and again, how long are the Europeans going to talk about security guarantees? Why can't they just decide what those security guarantees, are going to be? And the fundamental problem with the issue of security guarantees is it requests of the Europeans to offer something that they weren't willing to offer at the start of the war, and that is military support in the event of an invasion, by Russia. You know, they were happy kind of nudging Zelensky along on the path of joining NATO, but weren't happy then to step in when, very predictably, I'm afraid to say, Russia then invaded. They have to have real clarity about what security guarantees means. It means allowing Ukraine to kind of, you know, have a ceasefire, with the Russians, allowing some sort of normalization of relations across, the Eurasian state, but having clarity about what the military options are that would be at the Europeans' disposal should there be another war in the future, and that may have to involve some sort of military intervention in that eventuality. But surely the point of a peace deal is that actually you price in or you structure in the idea that the peace will last, right? If the peace deal is to kind of land and really be enduring, then there has to be some sort of plan in place for that peace to stick over the long term, so that the security guarantees make themselves redundant. Because actually we learn to live in peaceful coexistence with each other in the future. And as I keep coming back to, I mean, that has to involve some sort of dialogue with Russia about the future shape of the relationship with Russia too. Any peace deal that only factors in Ukraine and Europe will not last. A peace deal has to kind of look forward and think about, how Europe and Ukraine and Russia together collectively are going to coexist peacefully with each other. That is what a peace deal, should look like, without getting into the nitty gritty details of the individual clauses, within it. Without any sort of a reset, with Russia, then that peace won't last. And I still see very little evidence that anybody in Europe is really thinking about the Russia piece of a peace deal, if that makes sense. And they really need to be, if they're serious about peace and don't want to immiserate, frankly, the poor Ukrainians, even further. So I'll stop there, on the war. There's nothing much more to say. I mean, the Europeans just need to get behind the peace and stop saying, well, you know, it's only Putin that doesn't want peace. This is utter nonsense. I mean, they say this to continue the war. The Russians will accept peace so long as it's a negotiated peace, not a peace that they believe that the Europeans are trying to impose on them, completely disregarding their core strategic interests. It has to be a negotiated settlement. Stop talking about, oh, we're the only people that want peace. This is complete nonsense and a total fabrication. Just get on with the talks and stop all this performative nonsense and sad-faced appearances in Kiev, say, oh, how difficult it is, but not offering any real solutions. That won't help anybody. It certainly won't help the Ukrainians. So get over it and get back to diplomacy, is what I'd say. So on other news, the Mandelson affair rumbles on. He got arrested, then he returned to his home in the middle of the night. Poor old Peter Mandelson, poor old Mandy. And of course, not surprisingly, lots of people are coming out to the woodwork to say they'd warned about Mandelson before. The government is slowly nudging towards publishing the details of how he received top secret security clearance, in a very kind of quick and truncated, way. And I did a video post about this. If you haven't seen it, please, do watch it. I've said enormous circumstances had the facts of Mandy's relationship with Epstein had been known by the security vetting officer, assuming there was a security vetting officer. We don't even know that there was by now. Apparently, it's rushed within a few weeks, and normally it takes months. Just saying. But had the vetting officer known about the nature of Mandy's relations with Epstein, then I'm quite clear that he would not have received top secret security clearance. But anyway, there are lots of people coming out of the woodwork now to say, oh, they warned about this all along. It's amazing they weren't anywhere when Mandy was made ambassador to the US. But now they're all coming out to say, well, yes, we said about this. We said this was a problem, after the event. What complete hypocrites. I mean, the Speaker of the UK Parliament, Lindsay Hoyle, is apparently tipped off the police that Mandy was about to fly off to the British Virgin Islands, and that's one of the reasons he had to be arrested quick time before he got into a private jet, another private jet, and was shuffled off to the British Virgin Islands. And then Lindsay Hoyle is shocked that this information should be leaked to the press. Oh my God, what a joke. So yeah, it's the Mandy saga rumbles on, as does the Andrew impasse, the Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the Andrew formerly known as Prince. I don't think he's singing though. We're figuring out what to do with him. Both Mandy and Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, have been arrested on this really kind of flaky misconduct in public office cause, possibly future charge, which is going to be really, really hard to kind of land as a charge, it seems to me, because it's quite vague in its interpretation and broad in its interpretation. But I think that's all that they know what to do with, basically how both have misused their positions of power and been misusing access to kind of classified information to kind of share with their mates, essentially, is what it's about. Nothing about these poor women have been, abused and trafficked into the sex trade and all the rest of it. So the Andrew pivot right now is actually the issue of removing him from the line of succession. The Australians have solemnly come in and said that they would support removing Andrew from the line of succession. Now the New Zealanders have solemnly come in and said that they'd support removing Andrew from the line of succession. I mean, apparently every Commonwealth country has to kind of come out and say that they would agree to this, because apparently it's a Commonwealth competence. Who knew? Removing Andrew, formerly known as Prince, from the line of succession. That's apparently how it is. And there we have it. But I mean, Andrew was never going to become king anyway. It's a slightly meaningless gesture, removing him from the line of succession. It sounds good. It gets good headlines in the Sun and things like that. But it's a practically meaningless thing. And I fear that actually one of the reasons that we have this is to kind of gloss over the fact that we may find it difficult to charge him with a criminal offence. Honestly, that's why I think this is going. I can just imagine the policy wonk sitting around in number 10 saying, well, not sure we're going to be able to charge Mandelson, with a criminal offence. But why don't we remove him from the line of succession to distract the media's attention from the fact that we can't charge him with a criminal offence? So, yeah, I mean, it's a constitutionally kind of meaningless gesture, as he has so far down the line of succession anyway, that he wasn't ever going to be king. And but there you are. That's just why I don't really do conspiracy theories. But I mean that's just knowing how Whitehall works. That this is it feels like a backup plan. Let's remove Andrew from the line of succession. That's just how I see it. Even Stephen Hawking is now being pictured with women in bikinis. Gosh, how low is the British media? Yeah, poor old late Stephen Hawking, our beloved astrophysicist, looking all broken up, laid out on a sun lounge. I shouldn't find this funny, but even poor Stephen Hawking was pictured with women in bikinis at an Epstein facility. I just who's gonna be next? Craig Revel Horwood from Strictly Come Dancing. Oh my god! I mean, how many people? I mean, I don't know. I don't know what to feel about this, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I think Epstein was a truly dreadful individual and caused all sorts of horrible things to women and so on, and was hung on by all these kind of slimy, socially climbing individuals like Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and Mandy and apparently now Stephen Hawking, and many others. But I don't know. I don't know really what to think about this apart from, I mean, who gets implicated? What do you do? I mean, we've already found with Andrew, formerly known as Prince, that we may not even be able to charge him with criminal offences because, it's so difficult. But it's just a bit of a freak show and one that continues to entertain and titivate the British media for good or for ill. So Trump's State of the Union address was another kind of theatrical titivation, but also not quite as bizarre. Stephen Hawking with women in bikinis, not quite that bizarre, but still bizarre. And I think actually, if you look at the media reporting, I think some parts of the British press are already pricing in, the Republicans losing power in 3 years' time. That they're already starting to think that Trump is so bad that poor old blue-eyed Maybelline eyelined JD Vance, might lose his shot at taking over from Donald from the Donald. And so that is essentially summarizes how they've reported the State of the Union, just a bizarre, a typically Trump-esque, with no real new policy ideas. And of course, the big policy everybody wants to know about right now. Obviously, people want to know what's happening in Ukraine, and I do still credit the Americans for doing good work on Ukraine. In the face of the Europeans who seem to want to block any effort to kind of bring real peace to Ukraine, which I think is frankly scandalous. But it is on what's going to happen with Iran, and I think actually that the truth is the Americans don't know. I think Trump has painted himself into a well, you can't really have corn in the sea context, but you know what I mean? Metaphorically, he painted himself into a corner with this. He doesn't really know what to do now because the whole thing is just a massive gamble, hoping for the best that the Iranians are going to back down. But if we've learned one thing from the past 4 years, is that actually in a multipolar world, we've now got to a point in time where smaller countries want to stand up to global bullies and not blink. And I'm not saying I'm on the side of the Iranian government by any means, but I mean, or that I approve of their methods of governance. But I can say that about many countries around the world. But I mean, what is clear is, they've seen the Russians standing up to the might of NATO and refusing to back down. And they're saying, well, okay, we're just going to carry on and do what you will. I mean, Trump doesn't have the ground forces to mount a sort of any sort of big operation. And the whole thing is a gamble that actually he can secure. But if we get to the point of military actions, in Iran, he can secure regime change quick enough before the logistical difficulties facing his big, but frankly not that big armada out in the Gulf become insurmountable, and he has to back away. And also, the risk, that one of his aircraft carriers gets hit by a supersonic missile. I mean, another report in the press today was talking about China potentially advancing the sale of supersonic air launched to sea kind of cruise missiles. I mean, I think as I've said it before, if a US ship gets hit in the Gulf by an Iranian missile, then Trump has nowhere to go but to up the ante, and then we don't, frankly, know where we're going to end up with this mess. So that's why he's in a holding pattern, really not sure what to do, hoping for the best, blustering through, thinking the Iranians may concede on a nuclear deal. I'm not sure they will, because they don't want to be bullied and backed into a corner. And so yeah, I think we're kind of stuck, and Trump's far too long State of the Union speech doesn't really take us any further forward in terms of breaking that impasse. So we're stuck waiting to see what bizarre yeehaw move he does next. Meanwhile, at a time that the Americans' kind of influence globally, it seems to me, is on the wane. Certainly under Trump, he's kind of accelerated. I mean, he's making America great again, but globally, he's making, you know, he's making America irrelevant again, possibly for the first time. It seems to me, and including the UK, but also other European countries looking to hedge their international relationships more. And Ms. Starmer's already been to kind of China this year, which I think actually I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Starmer or anybody from the Uniparty main parties in Parliament. But what I do think he's trying to do, which is good and which makes sense, is to have a balanced set of relationships with Europe economically, with the US, and with China, and hence the kind of huge engagement into China that's been happening over, well, really since the Labour government came to power. I mean, this is not a new thing. They've been doing this right from the start, as economic development, believe it or not, is one of the top challenges of this current Labour government. And Merz has just arrived in China today, Friedrich Merz of Germany, and clearly the Germans are looking to do the same. I mean, that they facing a yawning trade deficit with China, and actually there's no way to kind of deal with that beyond dialogue and actual fruitful trade talks, which that rather than lecturing the Chinese, that the best way, it seems to me, is engagement. And that's what Starmer's already done, that's what Merz is doing, and Macron has been as well. So I mean, I think that is the tide, and particularly as Trump continues to help the USA alienate itself on the world stage, that trend is likely to continue as small and middling powers hedge their bets, not to cut off with the US, because that would be economic suicide too, but to hedge their bets and engage more with China. I only see this as fundamentally a good thing, frankly, and not just for global trade, but for world peace as well, just a reopening up of relationships, globally. Recognizing the kind of counter trend that we're going through at the moment, where individual nation states are reindustrializing too. Okay, that they may not be kind of inconsistent with each other, but now is not the time to kind of delve into that particular issue. And then the other piece article that I read today, which I actually thought was quite good, was Janan Ganesh, who I normally hate. I normally hate his really kind of effect over kind of work style of writing, to be perfectly honest. But he actually wrote something really good in the Financial Times today. How war stopped working, which I thought was a really good piece. And essentially his premise is that we've almost moved beyond the point of decisive military victory in battles. Obviously we had the Gulf War in 1991. I mean, you could say really the Iraq War, wasn't ultimately decisive, given the long counterinsurgency that ensued after that, and the entanglement that the Americans got into, and the thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that died, in the ensuing war and all the rest of it. That it would be hard to claim that as a decisive military victory in the same way that the 1991 limited but overwhelming engagement was, in the Gulf War. That's probably the last time that we kind of really saw decisive military victory. Maybe with the advance of technology and with the growth of other kind of peer powers in the world, we've got beyond the point in history where a decisive military victory is ever really possible, which I thought was really thought-provoking, as an idea. And we've certainly seen that in Ukraine, where both sides have ground themselves to a halt. Okay, Russia still has in many ways, in the longer attritional kind of perspective, the strategic advantage on the battlefield. But it would nevertheless be impossible to say that Russia has, after 4 years, delivered a decisive battlefield victory. It hasn't, even though it finds itself on top in when you weigh up the balance of kind of the balance of advantage on both sides. I mean, that is true, but there hasn't been a decisive victory, and maybe we're moving to a point where that's not possible. Which again, you look at what's happening in Iran. I mean, it's impossible. It's impossible to see, given the forces that the US has deployed, that they could achieve a decisive military victory in Iran. I mean, it just seems impossible, frankly, short of the nuclear, which heaven forbid that will never happen. It doesn't seem likely to happen now. I'm not saying that it would, but I mean, the Americans can't just defeat Iran unless they go all in. They're not proposing to go all in, and big question marks about China, Taiwan. Would it really make sense to actually invade Taiwan rather than just seek to reabsorb over the longer term horizon, which I actually think is what the Chinese are trying to do? Have we moved beyond kind of big wars that one side or the other wins? Which I think is a really good question, for the future, particularly as we think about peacemongering and actually trying to get to a world where we're thinking less about building up big wars to fight conventional kind of maneuver wars against single opponents, to a future where actually the big meeting point is through kind of people to people engagement, trade and commerce, which may be one of the kind of trends of multipolarity that we're starting to see as China grows, as the peer rival to the US, but in a way which is substantively different from the Cold War, when that peer rivalry was ideologically framed in a way that, frankly, it isn't really today. The Americans seem threatened by the Chinese just because they're big, not because they're communist. And I think that China has open borders and so on. So I think that philosophical shift is taking place, has taken place, and hopefully that can be a good sign for the future that we've moved beyond having these conventional wars. But it's in the nature of humanity that conflict still exists all around the world, and you look at sort of Africa, for example, as a classic case in point. How can we continue to promote peacemongering? That's the big homework question for today. The other kind of news from yesterday was that obviously the EU failed to impose sanctions on Russia, but the UK imposed its biggest sanctions package yet. I spoke about this emotionally kind of yesterday, but I mentioned briefly about Georgia that the UK kind of imposed sanctions on Georgia's largest kind of TV station, Amedi, which has basically forced me to kind of cut off any contacts I had with them because it would be illegal to do so. Fair enough. It's a bit annoying because I actually authorized half of the UK sanctions against Russia. I'm not saying I like sanctions, just saying that's my job at the time. But it is a case study in just how ineffective sanctions policy has become. Because the sanctioning of the countless entities that were sanctioned yesterday by the UK and this Georgian TV station were done so under the framework of the Russia sanctions regulations of 2019. And if you read those, if you're short of sleep tonight and you want to read the Russia sanctions regulations of 2019, I invite you to do so, you'll see that the purpose of the sanctions is to encourage Russia to cease and desist its destabilizing actions in Ukraine. I mean, that is, sanctions legislation exists to get Russia to back off of Ukraine. And so then, to justify sanctions, you have to show a link, between the person or the organization being sanctioned and that purpose, ceasing destabilizing actions, Russia's destabilizing actions in Ukraine. How on earth is sanctioning a TV station in Georgia going to assist in that aim? I mean, there's obviously no rationale, to that, quite frankly. And one of the reasons given for sanctioning TV Amedi was that actually that they've been involved in promoting Russian disinformation, which is utter nonsense, quite frankly. In my dealings with them, they were always incredibly careful not to do anything that was even remotely kind of pro-Russian, given the still widespread hostility towards Russia in some parts of Georgian society. But rather, this is a TV station that is very much anti-NATO enlargement, just because they basically, don't like the Saakashvili sort of agenda, sort of promoting this Atlanticism, agenda, which pulled Georgia into this devastating war in 2008, which led to the loss of 20% of its territory. It's for that reason that they actually kind of don't want to mirror EU sanctions against Russia. They don't want to get dragged into another war, with Russia. It's got nothing to do with actually supporting Russia. Quite the opposite. Georgia doesn't have any diplomatic relations with Russia. I mean, lots of Russians kind of fled to Georgia after the war started, avoiding the draft. But I mean, it's just ridiculous to even suggest that Georgia promotes Russian disinformation. And in any case, what leverage does it doesn't? But in any case, what leverage does Georgia have to actually get Russia to cease and desist its destabilizing actions in Ukraine? Absolutely none at all. This is a TV station that kind of reports to a Georgian-only audience about mostly Georgian things. They have Georgia's equivalent of Strictly Come Dancing, MasterChef, whatever, The Masked Singer, and all these kind of shows. It's a largely kind of entertainment-based TV station. Obviously, has a news channel too, but I mean, this is not exactly a propaganda outlet. I was talking to somebody in Tbilisi today, not from the TV station, by the way, just to be clear. Nobody take me to court. I've not been talking to a sanctioned entity today. And they said, well, the TV stations that support, the pro-NATO enlargement sort of parties in Georgia haven't been sanctioned. Who lie constantly, about the state of democracy in Georgia. They've not been sanctioned. It's just the people who want to promote regime change in Georgia, that will never be sanctioned. And the whole campaign against TV and Mady was being whipped up by some firebrand, idiotic kind of journalists and MPs in the UK, like Edward Lucas, for example, of The Independent, who were just obsessed that Georgia should be the second front against Russia, and will do anything in their power to kind of turn Georgia into this kind of the next NATO country, which would be suicide for Georgia, quite frankly. And it just amazes me that so few people could see how suicidal that would be. I mean, Georgia has a population of less than 4 million people. It is a small country with an absolutely enormous Russia to the north of it. It just wants to kind of get on with its life. It's got Iran a bit further south. It's got Turkey. It's got Turkey to its to its west. It lives in a very, very complex part of the world. And, the UK is sanctioning this Georgian TV station for disinformation. It's utter bollocks. I mean, it really is. They just can't. There's no other words for it. But there you are. That is the kind of the clouded dystopian sort of policy world that we live in here in the UK. Quite frankly, we'll do anything to kind of put pressure on Russia. None of which puts pressure on Russia. And we refuse to have a diplomatic engagement with Russia. So let's sanction some random Georgian TV show and hope for the best, because at least that'll give us something to say in the newspapers. I mean, this is a nonsense. This isn't policy. This is making stuff up as you go along. Not worried about the kind of harm and damage you're causing along the way. It's just ridiculous. But this is why I left the diplomatic service in 2023, ladies and gentlemen, to escape this nonsense and to actually express my own opinions, which is what I'm doing today. So thank you for listening in to me ranting on. Sorry about that. I mean, I wasn't poking fun at poor Stephen Hawking, but his photo with the bikini ladies. But I mean, it was just, I mean, I see a lot of bizarre stuff, but I mean, that has to be, one of the most bizarre things I've seen so far this year. But, the year is still young. There's still plenty of time for more bizarre things to come along. Alastair Campbell with Nazis, Nazi wife beaters, Boris Johnson turning up his hair in a mess in Kiev, wanting the war to continue, but wanting it to end at the same time. Thank you so much for listening to me rant on. Wherever you are in the world, somebody called me out for being woke, because when I say wherever you are in the world, whatever your religion, race, whatever language you speak, whatever your sexual orientation, I'm not being woke. I'm just being inclusive. I mean, I generally don't like wokery, so don't call me wokery if I just accidentally mention people of different sexual orientation when I end. I mean, I've got gay friends, don't have a problem with that. I don't have any hang-ups. But I hate wokeism, by the way. Let's be clear. I hate wokeism. But I am curious about anybody in the world, whatever their orientation in life. So please don't call me out if I say something that offends you. Just accept that I'm different. Just accept that I'm different. And but wherever you are in the world, whatever your race, religion, however you like to live your life. I wish you very, very much peace, and I look forward to talking to you again very soon.